Hello everybody, and welcome to the third episode of Designers Learning jQuery. Today we're going to take a look at using jQuery to add new content to our pages. And jQuery can add text, or it can actually create and add brand new HTML elements to our pages. So let's get started, take a look at how we can accomplish that. So we have a typical project set up just like we set up in episode 1. And you'll see that I have a very simple HTML file, but I don't have any actual content in the page. So let's go ahead and take care of that first. So I'm going to create a div with a class of content, and inside there, oops, I didn't want an H2, I want an H1. This is a heading, and then I just want to create a few paragraphs of text, and I'm just creating 5 paragraphs of text that just contain lorem ipsum. Now if you're wondering how I was able to create that so quickly, I'm using a package or like a plugin or extension for Sublime Text called Emmet, and in the show notes I will link to Chris Coyer's tutorial showing you how to use Emmet because it is very handy and I highly recommend it. Let's take a look at what our page looks like in the browser now. Oops, we have to save the file first. And we see that we have a heading and we have our 5 paragraphs of text. Now let's just really quickly pop into styles.css and write some styles for our page. Now in case you didn't know, CSS3 introduces a lot of new color names, so you can just memorize your favorite color names, which is a lot easier than trying to remember the names or the hex codes for all of your different colors. So I'll go with Misty Rose, and we'll go with deep pink, and then we'll just quickly style up our div with clouds of content. We'll set it to a width of 75% and a margin auto so it's centered on the page. So take a look at what that looks like now. Just the pinnacle of great design. There's a lot of really fun color names, so I encourage you to dig into those and take a look at things like Papaya Whip. Now let's figure out how we can add some new content to this page. So we have, of course, in our HTML file, we have jQuery attached to our page, and we have an empty scripts.js file. We'll open our scripts.js. And just like in CSS when we were selecting the body to style it, we use the body selector. So we'll use the same selector in jQuery. And let's append just a sentence saying this was added with jQuery. Just like that. And if we come over here and refresh and scroll down, we can see it down here. And if I open up the Chrome Developer Tools, you'll see that it's added down here right before the closing body tag. So that's how append works. It'll append it right before the closing tag. So if I actually wanted to keep that with my other content, I could put it inside that div, just like that. And now I can see it is in div class of content, and it's the very last thing inside that div. Now, just like we have append, we also have prepend, which will put it at the beginning, the very first thing. So here it is. This was added with jQuery, and if I open up the div with a class of content, you can see it right here. This was added with jQuery is the very first thing inside the div with a class of content. So that's really handy for adding things at the beginning or adding things at the end, but what if we want to add things more in the middle? Well, we also have functions called after and before. So in this case, let's insert it after the heading. So we'll get the H1 and we'll say after. And when I refresh the page, you can see here's my new bit of text that was added. And here it is. This was added with jQuery right after the H1. And just like we had append and prepend, we also have after and before. So I could change this to before, and when I refresh, you'll see that it's actually before the H1. So here's my H1, and the text is added before. So you can see it's pretty easy to select just the element that you want to work with and either append or prepend text inside of that element, or use before or after to append your text either before or after that element. These methods work pretty well if all we want to add to our page is a bit of text, but what if we want to actually create new HTML elements and add those to the page? Let's take a look at how we can do that. First, let's take a look at how we can create new HTML elements. So I'm going to get started by creating a variable. And if you're not familiar with JavaScript variables, just think of it as an empty container. And once we have the container created, we can put anything inside that container that we'd like. Inside this container, I'm actually going to create a new paragraph. If I wanted to select all of the paragraphs on the page, then we already know I would do that like this. But you can actually use very similar code to create new elements. So if instead of selecting all of the paragraphs on the page, if I actually wanted to create a new paragraph, I could actually just wrap that paragraph in angle brackets and add the closing angle bracket tag. And now jQuery will create a new paragraph element. Now, if I save my JavaScript file and go back over and refresh this in the browser, you'll see nothing is new here. And that's because we're just creating the new element. We're not adding it to the document yet. Let's add some text inside our paragraph. This is a new paragraph created with jQuery. And now we have a new paragraph and we want to add that to our document. So how can we do that? Well, we can take our paragraph and we could say appendTo. And we could say where we want to append it. So let's put it at the end of the div with a class of content. If we refresh the page, scroll down, you'll see now this is a new paragraph created with jQuery. If I look inside, here's my new paragraph. Now I can write any bit of HTML that I like in here. So for example, I could add a class to this, and then I could pop over into the CSS and style my highlight class. And you know what we're gonna do? Papaya whip, because we can. And there you see that it's sort of a pale orangey yellow, and now our paragraph is highlighted, and you can see we have a class of highlight. And if we pop back over here, we could say instead, of course, just like we had append and prepend, we also have appendTo and prependTo. So if I refresh the page now, you'll see that this is added first thing inside of the div with a class of content. We're prepending it to the div with a class of content. And just like we had append and prepend, and we have appendTo and prependTo, we had before and after, and we have insert before and insert after. So let's take a look at how we could insert after the, let's put it after the heading, the H1. And there you'll see that we have our H1 and then our paragraph with a class of highlight. And of course we could say instead insert before, and that will now show up before the H1. So here's my H1 and here's my paragraph with a class of highlight. Now we've taken a look at how to create new HTML elements and add those to the page, and I want to take a couple of minutes before we wrap up for the day to show you just a couple of quick tips that will help you out as you start working with these new methods. The first one is a nicer way to create new elements. We can pass in a string of HTML like this, but you could see that if we also had an ID on here and a longer string of text, that this little bit of JavaScript would very quickly get very difficult to read. So let's take a look at how we could do this instead. Let's get rid of all of this and create just an empty paragraph. Then what we can do is after the paragraph, add a comma and a set of curly brackets to add a new object. And an object, don't be scared of that word, it's just a set of key value pairs. So in this case, it's going to be a set of key value pairs that describe the different properties and attributes of our paragraph. We know that we want it to have a class of highlight. We want it to have an ID of new para, let's say, and we want it to have some text that says this paragraph was added to the page with jQuery. Okay, so this is how an object looks. It's a set of key value pairs. We have our key plus a colon and then our value, and each key value pair is separated with a comma, but note that there is no comma after the last key value pair. And the reason that that's very important is that will throw an error for you in your JavaScript and Internet Explorer, and it can be kind of a tough error to troubleshoot. So you want to be careful that you don't stick in that extra comma. So if we now save this and come over here and refresh the page, you can see that we have a paragraph with a class of highlight, an ID of new para, and the text. This paragraph was added to the page with jQuery, which is exactly what we have over here. And this is a little bit easier to read than one big long string of text. So we can easily see we're creating a paragraph. It has a class of highlight, an ID of new para, and this is the text. And we don't have to try to scan through one big long line of code to try to figure out what that paragraph looks like. So that's my first special tip for you. My second special tip for you, we're actually going to get rid of all of this code and we'll refresh over here so we have just our empty page. These methods, append, prepend, after, before, appendTo, prependTo, insert after, and insert before, in addition to being used to add new content to the page, they can actually also be used to move content around the page. So let's say, for example, we wanted to take this heading and we want to put it at the end of the document. Okay, the first thing that we'll do is select our heading, and then we'll say appendTo. We'll put it at the end of the div with a class of content, just like that. And when we refresh the page, you'll see it's gone from up here, but there it is at the bottom. So if we open up this, there it is, our H1. It's the last thing inside the div with a class of content. Now what we could also do is we could get the first paragraph, and there are lots of different ways to get the first paragraph, but let's just do it this way. So we get all the paragraphs, then we use a filter called first to get just the first one. And then let's go ahead and append that to the body. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So now we have this paragraph hanging out down here, and we'll see that it's the last thing before the closing body tag. So it's not in this div with a class of content with the other text anymore. We've pulled it out of there. You can see it's missing. There are only 4 paragraphs here, and here it is. It shows up later in the document, just before the closing body tag. So these elements can also be used to move different contents around the page and rearrange your page. That's my second quick tip for you today. And that's all we're going to cover today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time. If you enjoyed this video and would like to learn more about jQuery, pick up a copy of my book, jQuery for Designers, available now.